Thank you, Zoe. And in case you didn't know, the lyrics to Zoe's music are in the order of service. Although with that crystal clear voice, I'm sure you could follow right along. Today's reading came to me in a moment of grace this week. It came across my desk, and I found it to be perfect for today's service. It is an excerpt from a piece written by Jennifer Holland, who's a contributor to National Geographic magazine. It appeared in the New York Times just a few days ago. It's entitled Wild Messengers. Jennifer Holland writes, "About a decade ago, a brain tumor came to steal my mother away. It was diagnosed after she'd exhibited a series of strange behaviors, stranger than usual, I should say, as she was a quirky lady to begin with. And she very quickly went to a dark, quiet place that none of us could reach. Still, for a number of weeks, as she curled into an ever-tightening ball under a growing mound of blankets, she continued caressing her 3 cats as they snuggled against her. When her hands finally went still a week or so before her death, I knew we were nearing the end. Escorting a loved one through her last days wrings your heart dry. You keep smiling, helping, and hugging, knowing that soon enough you'll be able to collapse and grieve. But until then, you stay strong." One cold, gray day in February, in search of that one last bit of strength, I took a break. Family friends agreed to sit with my mom as she slept the day away, so I set aside guilt and got in the car and drove. Minnesota that winter morning was all steel sky. The pan-flat landscape slid by farm after farm, an austere poetry in the scenery that seemed about right. Anger was driving, its foot heavy on the gas, and my thoughts were boxed in tight and spinning. It took a while to banish my circular thinking with deep breaths and feel unbound. And then along one curving road lined with a particularly tall row of trees, something pulled at my gaze. Way up against the somber sky, a bald eagle perched on a branch. It was a splendid creature, and not an animal I was privy to seeing often in my usual suburban world. It alone would have lifted my spirits. But then I saw a second one, and a third. It seemed for a little while that every time I looked up from the road, I'd slowed to a near crawl by then, a bald eagle appeared. One flapped its huge wings, circled around and landed in the next tree. Another preened, its head twisted impossibly far to get its feathers around its back. Still another fell from above, like Tennyson's famed thunderbolt. 2 others perched like statues, doing nothing in particular, but looking spectacular. There were in total 9 bald eagles along that stretch of road. It was the 9th of February. And later, after I'd returned home and settled back on the couch next to the baby monitor broadcasting from her room, my mother took her last jagged breath. The quiet that followed knifed through me, but then came a sense of ease, of calm. The suffering was over. I'm not a religious person, not even a particularly spiritual one, though I often turn to the natural world to ease stress and quiet the mind. That night, though, I couldn't help but think that those birds were nature's messengers, sharing what was coming. Perhaps even telling me that final exhale was a good thing, powerful and beautiful in its lasting quiet. Given a list of possible messengers, I can certainly imagine my mom, a true animal lover, choosing majestic birds, their number matching the date, a little nudge to see if I was paying attention, to prepare me and say her goodbye. When I suspended my disbelief, it made perfect sense. Jennifer Holland. My sermon on grace last week seemed to have touched a nerve with many folks. After the services, several people told me stories of how grace had entered their lives and how it had changed their lives. Several others, too, expressed their frustration with my message. They told me that they couldn't connect with the topic because they didn't believe that there was some kind of outside force at work to bring grace into our lives. And sadly, one person told me that he sat in our service last week racking his brain, but he couldn't for the life of him recall a single case where grace had entered his life, even momentarily. One of the wonderful things about choosing monthly spiritual themes to preach about is that I get more than one bite at the apple. Reflecting on my sermon last week, I realized that I may have made grace out to be more than it is, or at least more than it is most of the time. I told you the story of finding my call one day while lying on a therapist's table and how it came to me like a neon sign flashing in front of my face. This was, I said, a moment of grace for me. The clarity with which it came, its unexpected arrival at a time when I needed it most, and the certainty, the clarity of the message, all combined to make this what I'll call a capital G grace moment. The same with the story I told you about the monk and the tigers and the strawberry, another capital G grace moment. These moments of epiphany, these moments of revelation, these moments where everything is revealed to us in a bolt out of the blue happen to us but a handful of times in our lifetime, if we're lucky. And I realize that calling these moments of grace puts a whole lot of pressure on both the term grace and on us as receivers of grace, as does the definition that I came up with for grace last week. Last week I told you that grace is the appearance of the holy, the divine, the sacred in our midst. It's a glimpse of what it means to be truly alive and present to the moment, a peek at what is possible. Then I went on to say, when it shows up, grace is an experience of authenticity and oneness, and it creates a deep appreciation for our connection with all that is and all that might be. Grace, I said, is in a flash where our wholeness is revealed. And so by defining grace in these lofty terms, I realized that I might have put grace out of reach for some of us. So let me say that grace is much bigger and also much smaller than this definition that I gave it last week. When I say it's much bigger, I mean that its definition and meaning go beyond what I claim it to be. And when I say it's much smaller, I mean that grace comes in a variety of guises and experiences, not just in those moments of epiphany that the monk or I experienced. Grace is more like a river, I think, with side streams and little eddies, riffles and runs through it, and some deep pools. And so I want to take a few minutes today to explore some of those other forms of grace. First, I'd like to look at the language of grace itself. Perhaps the word itself is a stumbling block, and maybe my definition didn't help much. So I want to try a little different approach. I would venture to guess that we've all witnessed grace in the sense of movement, in the sense of something being graceful, whether a ballerina maybe seeming to float across a stage, or a bird swooping and diving and soaring in the sky. Graceful is the term we use to describe these movements. When one is graceful, it looks effortless and fluid. The dancer and the hawk seem to be at one with the elements in which they're immersed, be it the music or the air. When we're in the presence of such grace, when we witness it, we are transported, inspired, we are sometimes in awe. Sometimes it can literally take our breath away. I think that we can agree that observing this type of grace, the ballerina and the barn swallow, is a universal experience. We've all observed graceful movements, I think. So what if our own lives were graceful, if they were lived gracefully, or at least if they contained moments of being graceful. Maybe we're not graceful all the time. But I guess if that were true, we'd find ourselves floating in a way, not struggling so much, not trying to control so much. The ballerina isn't doing battle with the music. The hawk is in tune with the currents of the air. Living our lives gracefully, we'd be aware of what's going on around us, and we'd be responding in concert with it, riding the waves rather than offering up all kinds of resistance. There is an element of unity that comes with being graceful. Or better put, perhaps it's about alignment. Alignment. When we are graceful, we are living our lives aligned with our principles and our calling or our purpose. When we are graceful, we have a keen sense of what's important and what's less so. We respond to what's happening in our lives from a place of knowing ourselves rather than simply reacting to forces acting upon us. Living graceful lives, we find a sense of calm, maybe even serenity. And as in the serenity prayer, we gain a sense of acceptance of the things that we can't change. There's a grace, too, in letting go, or at least in not holding on quite so tightly. So we become graceful, or graceful, if you wish, but first by becoming aware of our own circumstances, aware of the things that feed our spirits and those that deplete us. We can't find the alignment that I'm talking about if we don't have a keen appreciation for our place in the world and an awareness of what's happening all around us. As Marjorie was talking about this morning, heading to school every day and noticing the sunrise. In a sweet little volume entitled Small Graces, Kent Nerburn tells us, "Ours is a transient life, lived on the run and with an endless sense of process, of movement, of chasing the future. We seldom pause to shine a light upon the ordinary moments, to hallow them with our own attentiveness, to honor them with our gentle caring. Yet it is just such a hallowing that our lives require," he writes. We need to find ways to lift the moments of our daily lives, to celebrate and consecrate the ordinary, to allow the light of spiritual awareness to illuminate our days. To hallow and shine a light on our ordinary days. That is to become aware, the first step towards living a graceful life. But of course, becoming aware isn't enough. To live lives full of grace, we have to make a choice. We have to make many choices. If we want to be graceful, then when we hear the music, we must choose to dance. When we feel the wind in our face, we must choose to fly. Reverend Barbara Brown Taylor tells us that when moments of grace appear, our only part, she writes, is to decide how we will respond, since there is plenty that we can do to make them go away. And she names a few for herself. She said, number one, I can figure that I've just had too much caffeine again. Number two, I can remind myself that visions are not true in the same way that taxes and the evening news are true. Or three, I can return my attention to everything I need to get done today. Those are ways to miss out, to lose the grace that appears. Or, she writes, we can stop doing what we are doing long enough to see where we are, who we are with, and how awesome the place is. We can see it for once instead of walking right past it. Maybe even setting a stone or saying a blessing before we move on to whatever and wherever we are due next. If we're not paying attention, we don't hear the music or feel the wind. And if we don't stop what we're doing to notice and name these ordinary moments of grace, to capture them in some meaningful way, we can lose them as if they never happened. It can be the difference between stumbling through life and soaring. Barbara Brown Taylor, again, tells of a time she was taking out the trash when out of the corner of her eye she saw the sun setting across her garden, and it set her garden aglow with this fiery color. But the trash bag she was carrying was heavy, and she had to get it to the garage, to the garbage can. And so she did. And when she returned to the garden, the sun had shifted, and the moment was lost. When you hear the music, dance. Part of living our lives gracefully, too, is to cultivate a graceful spirit, or if you prefer, a graceful attitude. This means seeking out and being aware of the opportunities that we have to be gracious with each other, to offer each other moments of grace. When I was thinking about this, I recalled my grandmother, who used to drive from Rhode Island to our house in New York for holidays. She'd come down for Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter. And whenever she would get on the road, she would bring along a bag of apples. And when she stopped at a toll booth, this was long before Easy Pass, when she stopped at a toll booth, she'd pay the toll and she'd give the toll taker an apple. This would inevitably lead to a brief conversation, sometimes more than brief to the consternation of the drivers behind her. But it was a connection. She made a connection with the toll takers with that apple. And for that toll taker, my grandmother was offering more than an apple and a kind word. She was giving him or her a moment of grace. Graces, the small ones, take many forms. And even if we don't see them as such, they can be moments of grace to others. When we see a young mother with children in tow at the grocery store and let her go ahead of us in line, when we make room for someone to merge ahead of us in traffic, when we spend an extra few minutes at coffee hour to sit and listen to someone who needs to talk. All these are moments of grace, small gifts, unexpected, and oh, so welcomed. And they are ours to offer. Here's an apple, just because. Just because. In our hectic lives, we are so grateful to have someone take the time to listen to us, to simply see us and acknowledge us. To offer these things to others is to dance to the music, to be graceful. And to receive these things is to be the recipient of grace. In our reading today, you heard how 9 eagles appeared to Jennifer on the day of her mother's death. Grace may be as big as that. Grace can be as big as an epiphany that alters our lives forever. Or it may be as small as an apple, or a hug, or just a bit of time. Maybe you don't even call it grace. You might call it kindness or gratitude or just being human. It may be lasting or it may be over in a blink of an eye. Either way, big or small, momentary or permanent, grace abounds and grace abides if we but listen for the music and turn our face to the wind. This day and every day, I wish you peace. Amen.